Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for participating in our first ever Disability Dialogue Week at Booth UC. I hope you've been enjoying the Post in the Populi and other scheduled events throughout this week. We are especially looking forward to our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Nancy Hansen. Before we get started, however, I would like to acknowledge that in the community of Booth University College, it is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene's people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We acknowledge that this land is historically a meeting place of community and culture. As in the past, the diversity of peoples who occupy this land and the emerging culture that enrich our community today present to us an invitation to build a stronger community as we learn to walk gently with one another in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. We also acknowledge the role of Creator God in our lives and as individuals and as a school. I invite you to join me in welcoming his presence with us today as we ask for his blessing on this teaching. Maybe we see things differently after today. Maybe we understand more fully. May we value others in our community and love them as our Creator does. Amen. Our teams of volunteers have worked with diligence and enthusiasm to put together the events of this week. Our desire for this Disability Dialogue Week is to encourage, educate, and empower our community in ways that celebrate our diversity and strengthen our commitment to inclusion. I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce our planning committee members: Barnabas Allen, Mandy Elliott, Rhonda Friesen, Belinda Guerra, Kimberly Kakagemic, Amina Mohammed, Margaret, Malakwu, Patience Ona, Matt Peters, Lindsay Tasharo, and me, Ashlyn Frost. Just a few additional details about our session today. First, if you haven't already done so, please mute your microphone unless you're asking a question or making a comment for us all to hear. Feel free to type questions into the chat as you listen. We'll be monitoring this and we'll be bringing forward the questions at the end of the presentation if time permits. Dr. Nancy Hansen will be speaking for about 30 minutes and we will leave the last 30 minutes for questions and response. We hope you will be active participants in this conversation. Finally, our speaker has given us permission to record this lecture. If you do not wish to be visible, please turn off your camera. But I would strongly encourage you to keep your camera on, as it is much easier for our speaker and the rest of us to interact with you when we can see you. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Nancy Hansen. Dr. Hansen is the director of the Interdisciplinary Master's Program in the Disability Studies at the University of Manitoba. Her research includes disability in spaces of culture, education, literacy, social policy, employment, healthcare, MAiD, medical assistance in dying, COVID-19, access and experiences of disabled people. She is co-editor of the Routledge History of Disability and Untold Stories, a Canadian disability history reader, and has published numerous book chapters and journal articles. Dr. Hansen will be speaking with us today about Encourage, Educate, and Empower. Disability Does That. Welcome to Booth UC, Dr. Hansen.
Thank you very much, Ashlyn, and I'm thrilled to be here. Please call me Nancy, right? I only get called Dr. Hansen when I want to make a point, and this is a relaxed conversation, hopefully. So I'm just Nancy, right? Okay. So I'm thrilled to be here. I think it's a real honor, and thank you to Ashlyn and Rhonda. If I may use people's first names, I think I should start with some context. First of all, I've always thought of disability as kind of a superpower. I'm borrowing something from the great Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, but I think disability is a superpower, and it encourages and educates and empowers all at the same time. We need context though, because I don't think people really have an understanding of the number of disabled people there are in the world. We are the world's largest minority group, 1.3 billion people, 22% of the Canadian working population, 1 in 4 in Manitoba. However, whenever we show up, it's kind of a surprise. I don't know where we're supposed to be, but we're never supposed to be where we are. Even in spaces where you would think that disability would be expected, right? It's still kind of a surprise. So we're always kind of making space in places where we're not expected, or places that weren't designed for us in the first place. And I think too, it's important to remember, I come equipped, I don't know if you probably can't see because they're on the side, with Harry and George. They're my crutches. I don't know which one's Harry and which one's George. We all just kind of hang out together. It's my own menage a trois. And it's been going on for a lifetime now, so it's all good. But the important thing to remember is that most disability is invisible, right? So you'd never know if somebody had a disability unless they declared. And because for some reason our society doesn't think disability is that sexy, which is their problem, not ours, that people don't necessarily come out as disabled because it's not seen as a winning identity, right? But we're going to change that. So particularly in spaces of education, right, there's this kind of problem in that we don't know disabled people in education. It's kind of a uh, it's not expected to be together until very recently, right? In my lifetime, and I realize I'm many decades older than you guys, but in my lifetime, it was illegal for me to go to regular school, right? So I got emancipated. I was emancipated at the age of 10, and I still think of it as Emancipation Day. And when we go on to spaces of higher education, in the academy, for example, disability still remains very unexpected, right? There's a kind of perception around disability that's not articulated that much, but because of larger society's understanding of disability as weakness, and weakness, defect, or something not quite right, there's an underlying assumption that somehow maybe the elite nature of the academy will be tainted by the presence of disability. So even though we're gradually making progress about the presence of disability, there's still a lot of, we have to make the space more comfortable. We have to get over I don't know about this yuck factor about disability being present. Disability has always been present, will always be present. As a matter of fact, whether or not it's acknowledged, it's always present, right? So we should expect disability from the get-go, because disability enriches the spaces in which we live. As a matter of fact, most every historic figure, especially in Western European culture, has had some form of disability in their biography. But that part is usually subject to cultural erasure, because it seemed to sort of take away from their expertise, take away from their accomplishment. So that element is neutralized, if you will. So we have to look at ways of expecting disability, expecting that disability is going to enrich the space in which you find yourself and make it better for everybody. And we have to recognize that disability isn't greater than or less than or anything defective. It just is. But historically, as a culture, we have decided to privilege certain ways of being, be it gender, be it sexual orientation, ethnicity, indigeneity, and disability, because we privilege certain ways of being, doing, and experiencing the world. And it's purely subjective. Culturally, majority culture has decided we will value certain groups of people over other groups, and it's purely arbitrarily, and it's purely subjective. We have to look at perceived difference as opportunity for information exchange, and opportunity to change perception rather than seeing disability as problematic. We should see it as an opportunity to experience the world in a different way, not better or worse or less than, just differently. And because of that difference, our experience is enriched. I know I sound like some kind of a greeting card, but I honestly believe that, right? There has to be a serious shift in the way we look at disability, right? Disability belongs, and it's always been part of the culture and society in which we live, whether or not it's acknowledged, right? So, and we have to get comfortable with our discomfort, because the only way that's going to change is through exposure and education and dialogue. This is why this week is so important, right? Because most of what we know about disability is my Uncle Fred talked to my Aunt Susan, and my best friend had a friend who had one leg, and therefore, but most of what is known about disability hasn't been provided by disabled people themselves. They've been talked about, around, through. We're often told, sorry, I'm talking too fast. Monica, I'll slow down a bit. We're talked about, we're talked through, we're talked over. We're told what we should be doing, when we should be doing it, and how we should be doing it. But again, most of the places where those conversations take place, disabled people haven't been present, right? So now is the opportunity to recognize that we're here. We're disability is cool, to use a 70s term, and we're not going away. And throughout your lifetime, a great many of you will have the opportunity to experience disability, because it's a natural part of the life course, right? And gradually, we're making inroads to places like the Academy, to places, to bigger spaces of culture, history, and other places where culture is valued. But I think in the Academy, there's still a lot of work to do. There's been a lot of tinkering around the edges. We're at the point where we say I'm being somewhat facetious, but not really. Some of my best friends are disabled people, and you have a ramp and a toilet. We're really cool. But we have to start doing some of the heavy lifting around what, if we keep doing things the way they've been done by especially in the Academy, there's hundreds of years of tradition and past practice that have usually been developed by old, white, heterosexual, non-disabled men. And they're fine, don't get me wrong, but there's so much more richness we can tap into, right? If everybody gets to come to the party, right? Because being in the Academy is such an opportunity. But if we keep doing things the way we've always done them, just tinkering around the edges, then nothing's going to change. So we have to stop sort of playing with language. We have to get comfortable with the word disability. I don't have special needs. I'm not differently abled. I don't have exceptionalities. I am a proud disabled person. I wouldn't tell other people what to call themselves, but that's how I proudly identify, right? And there is a tendency here in this society to talk about people with disabilities, and that's okay. That's the way a lot of government documents are formulated. But we don't go around with gender or with racialization or with sexual identity, right? It's not something that you drag around on a long chain that comes out at during the Christmas Carol. You know what? I'm not Marley. Disability is part of who I am, and I'm proud of it. My work is to help the rest of society grow up and get comfortable with disability, because we're not going away. And everybody's richer because we're here. If we can get together and recognize that disability is on the social justice human rights continuum, just as, say, BIPOC individuals are. And it's important to recognize when I'm saying that nobody is just one thing. I am not just a disabled person, right? I am not only that. I am a complex series of identities that are all intertwined and interlinked. So we have to get comfortable with intersectionality too. But somehow disability gets left off of the human rights social justice continuum, right? Because we get so hung up on the hypermedicalized element around disability, which doesn't really fit either. But that's the one that organizations and individuals who aren't familiar with disability often cling to, because that's what the wider culture has determined that is going to be the linking point. So I think there's an opportunity for growth. And what we have to do is to expect disability, to welcome disability, and really start to deconstruct a lot of the, shall we say, systemic ableist barriers that have kept disabled people out of the academy, in much the same way as other marginalized population groups are working to get into the academy, right? And the academy has to reflect the community, the larger community from which it comes, right? If it wants to be relevant, it has to be involved in the community in a meaningful way, beyond writing reports, beyond quantifying difference, right? Who benefits from quantifying difference? I would argue it's a starting point, right? Because if it doesn't exist, right, you can't address it or recognize it in a meaningful way. What is the academy? The academy is just a flashy word for talking about universities in general. That's all it is. That's it. When I say the academy, I don't mean to single out any particular university or college, because trust me, everybody has a lot of work to do, right? We have to get beyond writing reports and quantification to really getting down and getting into the interesting things. How can we do things differently? Because if we keep doing things the same way we've always done them, we're going to have the same result, which means a whole lot of marginalized people are going to be left out. You'll be allowed to come in and use the toilet and maybe sit at the front or the back of a classroom, but there has to be a real sort of a serious looking at how we've done things and how we can do things better, more effectively than we've been doing them in the past. And that's not to say anything is necessarily right or wrong. We just have to start doing them differently than we're comfortable doing them, right? I just saw a question flash by. I'll answer that when I stop talking, which should be quite shortly, actually. So I would say that expect disability. It's going to enrich the space, and we're going to have to remake space so that everybody's welcome and expected, not just welcome, but expected. So we don't have to use a lot of our energies trying to maneuver around an environment, and I mean the physical and attitudinal environment, so that we can spend our time learning and doing rather than figuring out how we're going to get somewhere. Anyway, I guess that's it for me for now. And I'm really keen on answering questions. Don't be shy, please.
Okay, so we do have one question here, Nancy, that is, what positive changes have you seen over the years?
Okay, I would say there's been positive changes and negative changes. Right now, the fact that we're all sitting in our various spaces being able to do this, for me, this is one of the most accessible spaces I've ever worked in, right? Because I can just come and sit at my dining room table and start doing my work. I'm able to go to different countries, different provinces, in different areas of the city without even having to leave my seat, right? So that's really important. The fact that we're having this conversation and it's called a dialogue, that's another important thing. There's been important shifts in legislation, both federally, provincially, and internationally. However, when I say that, what are the penalties for non-compliance, right? And there's still an attitude around disability compliance and accommodation to, well, that's good enough, it's better than nothing, because there's not many of those people around here. So what do we really have to do anyway? I'm being somewhat facetious, people, but not really. There's still a good enough or better than nothing approach to this, because the people making the decisions don't see themselves as being directly impacted by it. So it's good enough.
I kind of had something I wanted to, like, that I was thinking about when you were talking. So in terms of, I'm doing a little bit of research into different things, and growing up in the school system, having a learning disability and invisible disability. So I have dyslexia. I remember growing up, I had an IEP, so an individualized education plan. Now, in that individualized education plan, I don't remember ever somebody talking to me about it. It was always made the decisions from my parents and the teachers. And I'm thinking, if we want to like have, I feel like I had a lot to say even as a child around my disability, like things that I was seeing, the ways that I was feeling, but my voice was never heard. It was not allowed to speak up. It was always what my teacher said. It was always what, my parents, I know they fought for me, but they also didn't understand the frustrations that I had with them. Yeah, because there was times when like my mom was thinking she was helping, but she was sitting me in front of cue cards for like 2 hours, just going through the different cue cards. And if I forget or I'd mess it up, she would get upset. And it was frustrating for me as a child because it felt like nobody was listening to me.
Yeah, that's still going. It's still going on. I think that disabled people are very rarely listened to because there's a lot of, there's a lot of colonization going on in that. There's still the non-disabled person knows best, right? The non-disabled person knows the situation, right? But, and I'm not saying that there isn't knowledge to be shared, but I think it should be a more collaborative process and getting away from the body colonization, arbitrarily privileging certain types of being, certain types of learning, certain types of perceiving the world, and working together and listening to the people that are having the experience and working together to solve issues that come up, right? And for not working towards non-disability, but making the most of the creative elements that you have, the way that you learn. And I'm sure that the way that you learn has involved disabled people are creative, and that's the thing that people don't understand a lot of the time. We're creative by necessity because we're always trying to find workarounds in spaces and places, and I mean intellectual spaces and the physical spaces that were never meant for us to be there. So I think there has to be a collaboration and a recognition that disabled people have specialized and unique knowledge that they can bring to a situation to work on issues together rather than being chronically told what to do. Isaiah.
Yeah, thank you. So you're all getting my wheels spinning in a number of different, things, but I guess just want to, bring up one topic. Like, it's been helpful for me to think about how, disability comes in part from the social structures that we build. So if you need a degree in order to become a construction for person, and in order to be a general contractor or architect, you need to get into the academic space first. So there are series of barriers that prevent the people who make decisions about buildings, for instance, from being sympathetic to the needs of people other than the abled. And so it's been helpful for me to think about, where does disability come from, and where is the locus of disability? And I know there's a conversation out there, and there seems to be, like you Nancy, were very adamant and expressive about how important it is for you to identify disability with yourself, and identify as disabled. There is what I perceive to be a movement to relocate disability outside of individuals. And I guess maybe it's a both and. I wonder if you could speak into that whole conversation.
Okay, I don't think it's about relocating disability per se. It's about relocating the responsibility for making the physical attitudinal environment as accessible as possible. It's about, I'm comfortable having disability as part of my identity. I don't see it as a negative. It's part of who I am. It's enriched my life. I mean, I'm doing this job now because I have a disability, right? And it's truly enriched my life. And if I could change things tomorrow, I wouldn't. What we're seeing now is disability is no longer my problem, quote unquote. We have to look at how society perceives disability and how that's problematic. How disability privileges certain ways of being and doing, and how society privileges certain ways of being and doing in the world, and how there has to be a social responsibility in much the same ways as other marginalized population groups of saying, look, this is wrong here, we have to fix this. And we're not being grandiose by letting you in. We deserve the right to be where you are, whoever you is, right? That we are a community together, and we shouldn't have like channeled locations where we can access and egress either psychologically or physically, right? There should be a natural expectation that disability is present and prepared for, right? I mean, I'm a four-legged woman. I have crutches. I can't exactly walk into a room and say, who, me? I am not disabled. So I have to, and a lot of the time I have to make people comfortable with who I am and what I do, especially if I'm going into a new space, before we can get down to business, right? But that takes a lot of energy, and I will take that on, right? But nobody realizes the amount of physical and emotional energy it takes to maneuver in psychological and physical spaces where you're not expected to be, right? If I was to come to Booth physically, this is what I would have to get ready. It takes me 2 hours I'm still working toward a non-disabled time frame all the time, right? So I would have to start 2 hours ahead of time. I would have to arrange transportation 3 days before, and I would have to spend 3 hours on the phone doing that. And then I would have to get into Booth to a certain space that works for me. Oh, and I wouldn't drink any liquid on that day in that time frame, because I wouldn't know whether I could pee or not. I know that's a lot of graphic information, but disabled or not, everybody pees. So, and most of the time you don't have to think about where you're going because you can just do it. So that's the kind of acceptance we have to get with disability and marginalization and difference of all types, so that people don't have to spend all their energy just being in the space that they can just use it the way everybody else uses it.
I'm wondering if this is a good bridge into a question that's in the chat, which brings up the equity versus equality question. So I'll just read you the question, Nancy. Stephanie asked, do you feel that it's still important to talk about equity and not equality to support students? I'm thinking about what you said, disability is a natural part of the life course. My daughter's teacher said very proudly to me, I treat all of my students the same, which is not what our students actually need. So.
Exactly. I used to work for the federal government, right? And I won't name the department, but I used to work for the federal government. Being in university is my second career. And my boss said to me one day, and I'm sure she meant it as a compliment, she said, I don't think of you as one of those people. I don't think of you as a disabled person. And I'm sure that was meant to be positive, but no, definitely not. She wouldn't go up to a person of color and say, I don't think of you as one of those people, or a woman and say, I don't think of you as a woman. You know, it's like people are doing you a favor by not, it's not that at all. I think that I lost my train of thought. It has to be, I don't want to be, recognize my disability, but don't focus on it completely. See it as a part of everything as a part of who I am, not the all-encompassing identity. And pretending that it's not there doesn't do anybody any favors either, right? Thinking positively or treating everybody the same doesn't get rid of the stairs when I need a ramp. It doesn't, provide. I'm paraphrasing Stella Young here. If I think really positively about something, sign language. Well, in this case, sign language would appear because it's already here because you guys prepared for it. But Braille doesn't magically appear either, right? I mean, we have to sort of treating everybody equally is kind of like giving yourself social absolution for something that you don't deserve, right? Treating somebody equally, it has nothing to do with equity, right? Treating somebody equally is just a lazy way of looking at equity, I think, in my view. And it's overly simplistic, and it doesn't give the richness of diversity, however that's framed, the attention that it deserves, right? Disability is just one part of that continuum. The problem is, though, that disability isn't seen as a natural part of that continuum, and that's where we have to do the work. Mandy, I see your hand up there.
Hello. Thank you for your amazing talk. As a teaching professor, I love to try to bring as much equity as possible into my classroom, but I'm also always aware in the back of my mind that as soon as I say, use an example of a disabled writer or filmmaker, and there's a disabled person in the room, everybody turns and looks. And I guess I'm trying to think of how I can avoid tokenism or kind of singling someone out because in this case they would have a visible disability. Is that, how do I sort of help my students to see the whole person?
Okay, well, you can lay it out at the beginning. Do not expect whoever to speak for an entire population group or represent that population. What I think is really exciting is that you're acknowledging that there are disabled writers and filmmakers, right? That is a really important step, incorporating disability into your curriculum. So well done you, right? And just lay it out there from the beginning. Don't expect such and such to be the, everybody has to take this on board. It's not just, and I've been asked to sit on in various spaces and places, and I'll say no, because I refuse to be the tokenistic representation. Because if I show up in certain spaces, it gives what's happening credibility, right? And I don't want, and if I don't see what's happening as credible, I don't want my presence to sort of validate what's happening, because it's not, right?
Right.
So, and I think that's something that really has to be worked on in a whole lot of different spaces. And the academy is just one of them. And when I say the academy, I just don't mean the one I'm speaking in now. I mean, universities, colleges, and school in general, right? We have a lot of work to do.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just checking in on the chat again here, Nancy. So Belinda is asking, why is it assumed that people can communicate over a phone call instead of talking through an email? Some have a misunderstanding, and this does not follow the Accessibility Act. I don't know if you want to add or clarify anything there, Belinda.
Not really. I just come across this all the time.
Well, I think it's because we privilege, just as we privilege standing up, right? We privilege speaking over communicating in other ways, and it's just arbitrary privilege, right? Texting has been really important in opening up the world for deaf people, so that they can communicate directly and they don't have to go through. No offense, Monica, I think you're doing a fantastic job, but it's nice to have direct communication sometimes, and texting has been really important in doing that.
Thank you.
Terry also asks, how important do you consider spirituality into the caring practices, especially related to mental health care?
I think anything that provides support, provides validation, provides accommodation, and anything that works for an individual, go for it, right? You get supports where you can. Spirituality is an important bridge for support. I think it's terrific. And I think the more really inclusive people can be in accepting disability and difference, rather than trying to promote certain ways of being and doing, it's really important. Inclusion and support is great in all sectors, because we really do need it. And we need well-informed allies too. Those are priceless, because the reality is, if I walk into a room and ask for X, Y, and Z, I might be seen as a crip with a chip on her shoulder, right? Whereas somebody who's non-disabled or doesn't identify their disability can walk in and ask on behalf of, and it may not be seen as having another axe to grind or whatever, or being seen as some kind of uppity crip or mouthy crip. You know what I'm trying to say here? The more allies I can get in getting things done, the less energy I'm going to use, and the more I can do in other sectors, right?
Yeah, thank you for that, Nancy. I'm going to ask one of my own, and I'm wondering, you raised a comment, or you used the term hypermedicalizing, or the hypermedicalization of disability. And could you just talk about that a little bit more? Where does that come from? How does that impact people with disabilities? How do we address it, etc.?
Okay. Well, first, it finds itself in an era of eugenics, right? Back in the late Victorian era, we're going back about 150 years or so, right? Where we see certain types of people as being better than other types of people. So, and historically, at least in that period of history, disability was seen as defective, or something is missing, or something. It's cure, correction, or death. That was like, those are your options, right? I'm being somewhat facetious, but again, not really. There's still an assumption that disabled people are craving able-bodiedness. No, we're not. We're not craving non-disability. What we are craving is dignity and respect in all aspects of our lives. But because there's been this thing that disability is defect, weakness, correction, or something of that ilk, medicalization has been the portal through which we access goods and services and whatever. Like, for example, how many of you, when you want to take the bus, have to go in for an interview to prove that you have a right to access that bus, right? That's what I have to do every couple of years or so. I have to go to Transit Plus, and I use that term advisedly. And they ask me questions like, can you dress yourself? Do you clean your house yourself? And all these questions have nothing to do with taking a bus. So I politely said to the person asking the questions, I said, I will answer anything that has to do with taking transportation. However, whether I clean my house or whether I need help taking a bath or dressing, it's not relevant to taking a bus. And this woman looked at me like I had 6 heads because I was being non-compliant, but I am allowed to take the bus, having not answered the questions. But there's a lot of whether I get the disability tax break is also determined by my doctor. Whether or not I can get somebody to clean my house in certain circumstances is determined by my doctor or a social worker, right? And historically, until very recently, there's been very little encounters with the realities of lived experience of disability in the medical profession or in the social work profession. And right now in the medical school, I'm part of a panel that talks about disability and independent living, but it's 3 hours in first year in a 4-year medical curriculum, and that is seen as progressive, right? And within social work curriculums across the country, it varies in how disability is addressed, which for me is quite, for both of these professions, it's concerning to me because these groups of people have an inordinate amount of control over my life, right? But yet very little exposure to the actual lived experience of a person with a disabled person, right? And so a lot of times what happens, people aren't immune from the culture in which they grow up in, right? And they're projecting a lot of their knowledge or discomfort on the individual that they're supposed to be dealing with a lot of the time. So I think that is an area that has to be dealt with in a more effective manner. I hope that's okay.
That's great. Ashlyn, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about social work because I'm also in social work. Yeah, I think a lot of the times that what they teach us in class is be reflective of your own biases and prejudices, and a lot of it is internalized where maybe you don't realize you have these things. I'm just trying to think of because I want to be the best social worker that I can be, and I want to empower people to have their voices heard. And I think it does help that I have a disability myself, but I do not know all of the lived experiences of people with disabilities, and I don't want to overpower their voices. So what would you say to me on things that I could do to make sure that I don't do that?
I would say ask and listen. Because all the time, disabled people are being told what, when, and how, like I've said, to do things. If you can listen and offer suggestions and work together in a partnership, and that would help a lot, because there's very little partnership in a lot of the time dealing with disability, right? Like you alluded to your earlier academic experience when your voice was never heard, right? A lot of disabled people have never been given had not given but had the opportunity to use their voice, to be heard, to be listened to, and to be recognized that they have something, we have something, you know, valuable to say, something necessary to contribute, right?
Mhm. I think as well, like, because I'm thinking back to my paper that I'm writing about disability inequality in the education system. So just reflecting on that, I was thinking about my experiences in the school system with an IEP, with a disability, the way the system treated me as a child, but then also thinking of ways of like, okay, if I was a school social worker, I would sit and listen to the kid. And then I would be like, okay, how do you, like, what are you feeling about this? How are, you know, like your teachers treating you? And then like advocating with the child. I think that that is so missing, especially for children. It's usually expected to fall upon the parents or the teachers. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
but knowledge you have, like add things to do, I want to learn as much as I can.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think what you say is important about primary school and middle school and high school. That's important. But where this really has to be driven home hard is that disabled people belong in higher education, right? I was told, and every disabled colleague that I have across internationally was told, we're not PhD material, right? You're not PhD material. That's okay, you know. And I, you know, and everybody I know who's gone into university, who's gone into graduate school and postgraduate stuff, has been told the same thing. There's this underlying percolation that you're not really supposed to, you know, you have to prove that you are here. You're not expected to be here. We'll tinker around with stuff, but really you're not supposed. So you have to have a very thick skin, and you have to go up against some pretty hardcore stuff, because the university, the college is uncomfortable with you being there. And they may not recognize that they're uncomfortable with you being there because they still have a lot of work to do. And when I talk, I want to reiterate again, I'm not singling out any particular university or college. Everybody's got to do the work. And until we start really doing it, disabled students have to develop a very thick skin, and being able to push articulately, but being able to push, because those in power do not understand disability yet, for the most part, right? They do not understand the value of disability being there. So we have to work on that. And we have to recognize, surprise, surprise, that disability is on both sides of the desk. And that is what's uncomfortable for the academy too, because again, the elite nature of the academy itself may be seen as being compromised by the presence of disability, but that's completely wrong. Just as it's completely wrong for any other marginalized population group.
Just kind of like what you were saying along like education. I know I brought this up to you before, but I feel like it's important to share with the whole group. When I had my very first teacher when I was 5, I wasn't diagnosed with dyslexia at the time, but they had suspicions that I had it. And my teacher told my mom in a parent-teacher interview that I was dumb and that I was not going to make it to university. She told my mom that in a parent-teacher interview. And that ideology was very explicit, like really out in the open. But when you go in the school system, it's also very implicit. Like I wasn't allowed to use my IEP. I was put in the back of the classroom where I had to wait a full week and didn't get the lecture from the teacher because she didn't feel comfortable teaching me. I had to wait for a whole week or so for the EA to come and visit me. And, you know, your peers make fun of you. Your teachers call you out in class because they want you to answer the question correctly, but they don't understand that the way that you feel about yourself, or the way that, you know, they want you to be fitting in and be like everybody else, but you know, you're different. And for a long time, I actually didn't think I was ever going to make it to university. In fact, I almost didn't apply to college or university, but now I have my degree in social service work and now almost my bachelor's of social work, you know, and learning about disability, like what the school system made me feel like was that I can't do it. They made decisions for me that I was to go to a special school for people with disabilities. I didn't get the choice. I was told, you're going to this school. And I went to that school and it was helpful and all of that. But then when I went back to the regular school, it was the same thing. The teachers didn't, I missed out on a few years of actually learning about certain subjects in class because they decided that they didn't want to teach me. And they just passed me along.
Yeah. Yep. That's happening a lot. So I think, and it's still happening in spaces. I think that universities and colleges think they're incredibly progressive, right? But they're not. They're very comfortable and progressive with established practices as they know them, right? And look at, I mean, and like I've said before, until we really start deconstructing what's happening and determining what are the key elements, right? What are the key elements that really are necessary to do the job, and how much of them are really built around traditional practice that we're comfortable with, right? Why do we have to have certain timelines to finish school? Why do we have to do things in certain ways? You can cover the material as long as the material is covered. I mean, I gave a presentation in dentistry the other day, and I said, look, I don't care how long it takes for somebody, I don't care who has their fingers in my mouth. As long as they know how to do the job, that's all I care about, right? These arbitrary notions of time and speed are all arbitrary, and the way of doing things. As long as the information is covered, that's okay. Excellence comes in different forms. Experience comes in different forms. As long as the material is covered, that's fine. As long as you have excellence in material, that's a knowledge base, that's fine. Having a disability doesn't mean you're settling for something. It just means you're bringing something extra to the party. You're bringing extra creativity and you're bringing life experience. And that's what people have to understand for any marginalized groups.
Yeah, well said, Nancy. And Ashlyn too. There's a number of comments here just thanking you for your honesty, Ashlyn, and courage in sharing your story. I'm wondering, we've got just a few minutes left in the hour, Nancy. So as you know, the theme for this week has been to educate, encourage, and empower. And so I'm wondering if you have any last kind of practical tips for us, practical things that we can do around educating ourselves. And Isaiah has asked very specifically if you have any resources or books that you can recommend so that we can continue our own education around encouraging the kind of change that we've been talking about that is necessary, and how to really empower our the members of our community, our students, our staff, our faculty who have disabilities. How do we empower them? If you just a few practical tips.
What I can do is I will send you, Rhonda, a pile of resources, and you know, rather than picking and choosing various things, because depending on what people want, what people will require, the information, it's a whole lot of different things. So I'll send you information and you can decide what you want to do with it. That's what I can do. And all I can say is expect disability and just expect disability, prepare for it. Ask questions, don't assume things, and don't don't necessarily assume that disability is the only identifier that that individual wants to be known by. Sure, disability can be a point of pride, but disability is just one part of one's makeup as a human being. So I think we can look at incorporation and just include disability, expect disability, and recognize disability as richness and something we can all benefit from, and see disability as an opportunity rather than a problem.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you everyone for joining and participating in this dialogue. I think it's so very important. As Nancy mentioned, she'll be sending resources our way, which we can post in the Populi dashboard. There are more resources that will be coming up in the next few days. There already are some posts that have been made earlier this week. So just encourage you to take a look, participate as you can, and let's keep this dialogue going. Let's keep the conversation going. It's so important for all of us. So.
Rhonda, did you want me to stick around after the main presentation? Sure. Okay.
Sure. All right. Thanks again, everyone.